This video consists of 10 chapters to introduce the operation procedures and precautions when removing and assembling the parts of diesel engine of MC11 series. Before disassembly and assembly, we shall get to know the following precautions at first. Number 1. When to lubricate the junction surface of parts. Do not use tools as they may drop off impurities, thus polluting the junction surface. Also, pay attention to the cleanliness of hands when doing so with hands. Number 2. As the crankcase cover and connecting rod bearing shell of MC11 series engine adopt cracking technology, which unique shape of cracking surface so it cannot bear external force, and shall be placed face up. The damages to the cracking surface of a crankcase cover will disable the entire crankcase assembly. Number 3. Do not wipe the cracking surface with cleaning cloth, but use a cleaner. Number 4. The front and rear oil seal of MC11 engine is made of PTFE. Due to high internal pressure, side A is easy to be bent, so the guide sleeve and tooling must be used correctly during installation, as tiny oil on contact ring and sealing ring will lead to oil leakage. Before assembly, clean the oil on the tooling and oil seal. The oil seal must be installed within 20 minutes after opening to prevent deformation. Number 5. 5900 sealant used to be installed in the engine will slowly solidify in air, so the installation should be completed within 10 minutes after applying the sealant. Number 6. When removing relevant parts of cooling circuit, drain the cooling water within the engine at first. Chapter 1. Electrical element. 1. Removing and installing the sensor. MC11 series engine is installed with 6 sensors, namely inlet temperature and pressure sensor, water temperature sensor, common rail pressure sensor, camshaft signal sensor, speed sensor, and oil pressure sensor. Removing the sensor. Before dismounting the sensor, pull out the connecting wire harness of each sensor and remove the fixing bolts of the sensor. Installing the sensor. When installing the sensor, note the tightening torque: 2 to 5 Newton meters for inlet temperature and pressure sensor, 30 Newton meters for water temperature sensor, 70 Newton meters for common rail pressure sensor, 8 to 10 Newton meters for camshaft signal sensor, 10 Newton meters for speed sensor, and 50 Newton meters for oil pressure sensor, and then connect the wire harness. 2. Installing and removing EDC and bracket. Removing the EDC. EDC is fixed on the EDC bracket by 4 bolts. Firstly, fully open and pull out the wire harness connector. Unscrew the bolts and remove EDC. Removing the EDC bracket. The EDC bracket is fixed on the crankcase by 4 bolts. Unscrew the bolts and remove the EDC bracket. Installing the EDC bracket. Firstly, place the rubber washers on both sides of the bolt hole of EDC bracket. Screw in the fixing bolts and tighten them to 13 Newton meters. Installing the EDC. To install EDC, screw in the fixing bolts and tighten them diagonally to 11 Newton meters. When connecting the harness plug, note to lock the fixing device after inserting the harness plug appropriately to prevent the pin from deformation. Chapter 2: Cooling System. 1. Installing and removing the fans. Removing the fans. The silicone oil fan is fixed on the fan bracket by 4 bolts. Unscrew the bolts and remove the fan. Installing the fans. The silicone oil fan is fixed on the fan bracket by 4 bolts. Loosely mount the silicone fan on the fan bracket and tighten it. One. Installing and removing the cooling water elbow. Removing the cooling water elbow. Unscrew the fixing bolt. Pull down the cooling water elbow, take out the adapter pipe. Unscrew the fixing bolt and remove the cooling water elbow. Installing the cooling water elbow. Install the cooling water elbow with O-ring. Screw and tighten the bolts. Apply a thin layer of Vaseline on the assembly surface of the adapter pipe. Install the adapter pipe into the waterway. Install and tighten the cooling water elbow. Apply Vaseline evenly on the O-ring seal. Install it in the cooling water elbow, and then install the cooling water pipe. Three. Installing and removing the thermostat. Removing the thermostat. Unscrew the 3 fixing bolts of the thermostat elbow. Remove it and then remove the thermostat. Installing the thermostat. Select appropriate thermostat. Place the seal ring outside the thermostat. Install the thermostat. Note, the vent hole on the thermostat shall be located right above. Fasten and tighten the thermostat elbow with bolts to 30 Newton meters. Four. Installing and removing the thermostat housing. Removing the thermostat housing. Unscrew the fixing bolts of the thermostat housing, a total of 6. Remove the thermostat housing and remove the adapter pipe. Installing the thermostat housing. Apply Vaseline evenly on the O-ring seal and the adapter pipe. Install the thermostat housing gasket and the thermostat housing onto the cylinder head in turn. And screw the bolts and tighten them diagonally. Five, installing and removing the water pump. Removing the water pump. Unscrew the fixing bolts of water pump. And remove the water pump and gasket. Installing the water pump. Loosely fit the water pump and gasket onto the distribution shell, and note the different length of fixing bolts. Tighten the fixing bolts diagonally to 30 Newton meters. And install the water pump pulley. Tighten the bolts to 35 Newton meters. Six, installing and removing the distribution shell. Removing the distribution shell. Dismantle the fixing bolts on the distribution shell and take it down. Installing the distribution shell. Install the gasket and the distribution shell in turn. Screw in the bolts. And tighten them diagonally to 30 Newton meters. Note, tighten the lowest bolts at first. Chapter 3. Engine Accessories. 1. Installing and removing the air compressor. Removing the air compressor. Dismantle the intake tube. The water inlet and outlet pipe of the air compressor. Equip the water inlet and outlet pipe with quick connector. Unscrew the fixing bolts of air compressor and take it down. Installing the air compressor. Before installation, clean the junction surface of the air compressor and the crankcase. And apply 5900 sealant on the junction surface of the air compressor. Note, the tree scrap is coherent and uniform. Align with the locating sleeve. Install the air compressor, screw in the bolts and tighten them diagonally to 40 Newton meters. Connect the water inlet and return pipe of the air compressor. When you hear a sound, they are installed appropriately. And connect the intake tube of the air compressor. Two, installing and removing the starter. Removing the starter. Dismantle the starter cable. And fix the starter on the flywheel housing with 3 bolts. Loosen the bolts and take out the starter. Installing the starter. Install the starter onto the flywheel housing. Tighten the bolts to 110 Newton meters. And connect the starter cable. Three, installing and removing the flat idler and tension pulley. Removing the flat idler and tension pulley. Equip the diesel engine with 2 flat idlers and 1 tension pulley at the front wheel train. Press the tension pulley clockwise to release the belt. Unscrew the bolts, remove the flat idler. Unscrew the bolts and remove the tension pulley. Installing the flat idler and tension pulley. Before the assembly, check the rotation of flat idler and tension pulley for blockage. Align the bolts with the gasket, flat idler and lining in turns, and fasten them onto the distribution shell to 60 Newton meters. And fasten the tension pulley with bolts. Note the position of locating pins. Tighten the bolts to 47 Newton meters. And press the tension pulley clockwise to install the belt. Four, installing and removing the generator. Removing the alternator. Dismount the generator harness. Fix the alternator on the alternator bracket. Unscrew the fixing bolts of generator and remove the generator. Installing the alternator. Install the alternator onto its bracket. Tighten the fixing bolts of alternator. And connect the alternator harness. Chapter 4. Intake and Exhaust System. 1. Installing and removing the intake manifold. Removing the intake manifold. When dismounting the intake manifold, please note to install the alternator bracket below the intake manifold. Installing the intake manifold. Apply 5900 sealant on the contact surface of intake manifold. Install the intake manifold and tighten the fixing bolts. Two. Installing and removing the intake tube. Unscrew the fixing bolts of intake tube and remove the intake tube. Unscrew the clamp and remove the inlet elbow. Installing the intake tube. Position the inlet elbow on the turbocharger with clamps. Align the angles with the intake tube. Apply Vaseline evenly on the sealing ring. Install it onto the inlet elbow. Insert the intake tube into the inlet elbow and tighten the fixing bolts. Tighten the clamp nut with the tightening torque of 10 Newton meters. Three. Installing and removing the turbocharger. Removing the turbocharger. Unscrew the clamp bolts, dismantle the exhaust elbow and gasket. Remove the oil inlet. Oil return pipe and gasket of turbocharger. Remove the 4 fixing nuts of the turbocharger. And remove the turbocharger and its gasket. Installing the turbocharger. The extruded surface of the turbocharger gasket faces the turbocharger, and its notch faces upward. Install the turbocharger. And tighten the 4 nuts diagonally. When tightening the bolts of turbocharger, use crescent wrench to facilitate the installation. Tightening method: pre-tighten it to 10 Newton meters, and then turn 90 degrees to 100 degrees. Before the assembly, add a small amount of oil into the oil inlet of turbocharger. Place the oil inlet gasket at the inlet opening of the turbocharger. Space the hexagon socket head cap screw with a self-locking washer, and install the flange on the turbocharger with bolts to 40 Newton meters. When fastening the oil inlet, tighten the crankcase end at first, and then tighten the turbocharger end. The hexagon flange bolts spaced with turbocharger oil return pipe gasket is used to loosely fit the turbocharger oil return pipe onto the turbocharger. Tighten the bolts to 35 Newton meters. Four, installing and removing the exhaust manifold. Removing the exhaust manifold. Unscrew the bolts and remove the front, rear, and middle exhaust manifold respectively. Installing the exhaust manifold. The raised side of exhaust manifold gasket faces outward, and loosely fit the middle exhaust manifold onto the cylinder head at first. The front and rear exhaust manifolds are installed with exhaust pipe sealing ring, whose opening shall be staggered by 90 degrees in direction. When tightening the exhaust pipe, pay attention to the tightening sequence. Tighten cylinder 3, 4, 5, 6, 2, and 1 in turn. Tighten the bolts in 2 steps. First, tighten them to 60 Newton meters. Second, turn the bolts for 90 degrees. Chapter 5. Cylinder Head. 1. Installing and removing the cylinder head assembly. Removing the cylinder head assembly. Rotate 90 degrees to open the lock pin. Dismount the harness assembly cover plate. The harness bracket and cylinder head cover. The bolts and gasket on the cylinder head cover are attached to the cylinder head cover, without the need for separation. Dismantle the rocker arm assembly and remove the EVB press block. Remove the exhaust valve bridge. Unscrew cylinder head bolts and lift down the cylinder head assembly. Remove the cylinder head gasket. Installing the cylinder head assembly. Rotate the flywheel so that cylinder 1 is located at top dead center. Rotate the camshaft so that the mark on the camshaft gear wheel can align with the machining surface of the inlet side of cylinder head. This position is the top dead center for the outburst of cylinder 1. Check the locating pin of cylinder head and place a new cylinder head gasket on the crankcase. Note: the cylinder head gasket is one-off. Lift and erect the cylinder head. Apply a layer of white T-assembly glue on the contact surface of cylinder head bolts. Screw in and tighten the cylinder head bolts. Note: the cylinder head bolt is one-off. Note: the cylinder head bolt is one-off. Tighten them according to the sequence and tightening method specified on the figure. Tighten the bolts in 6 steps. Turn to 10 Nm, 150 Nm, 300 Nm, and at an angle of 90 degrees for 3 times, respectively. Install the inlet and exhaust valve bridge. Note: the notch of the valve bridges must face camshaft. Install the rocker arm assembly and EVB press block with the bolt tightening torque of 105 to 115 Nm. Install the valve chamber cover. Tighten the bolts of valve chamber cover to 10 Nm. Note: the tightening must follow the sequence shown in the diagram. Install the wire harness support and cover plate. Adjustment of valve clearance. Adjustment of valve clearance. It is not allowed to adjust the valve clearance until the engine temperature is less than 50 degrees Celsius. The valve clearance for MC11 series diesel engine is 0.5 plus or minus 0.03 millimeters for inlet valve, 0.8 plus or minus 0.03 millimeters for exhaust valve, and 0.6 plus or minus 0.03 millimeters for EVB clearance. Tighten the lock nut of EVB pressing plate to 45 Nm. The adjustment methods for valve clearance is shown in the figure below. When cylinder 1 is located at the top dead center of outburst, adjustment shall be made to the inlet valve and exhaust valve of cylinder 1, inlet valve of cylinder 2, exhaust valve of cylinder 3, inlet valve of cylinder 4, exhaust valve of cylinder 5. Meanwhile, adjustment shall also be made to EVB clearance of cylinder 1, 3, and 5. Rotate the flywheel for 360 degrees. When cylinder 6 reaches the top dead center of outburst, adjust the exhaust valve of cylinder 2, inlet valve of cylinder 3, exhaust valve of cylinder 4, inlet valve of cylinder 5, inlet valve and exhaust valve of cylinder 6. Meanwhile, adjust the EVB clearance of cylinder 2, 4, and 6. 3. Installing and removing the valve oil seal. Removing the valve oil seal. Use the tooling that installs the valve lock clamp to take out the valve lock clamp. Remove the upper seat of valve spring and remove the valve oil seal. Installing the valve oil seal. Put the protective tooling of valve oil seal on valve rod sleeve and install the valve oil seal. Note: pay attention to the color of the inlet and exhaust valve oil seal, red for inlet valve oil seal and brown for exhaust valve oil seal. Tap the valve oil seal onto the valve rod with the installation tooling for valve oil seal. Place the valve spring and upper spring seat and use the valve lock clamp tooling to install the lock clamp appropriately.